Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's get the presentation started. Okay? Right, so I'm going to first, the report actually gives you some very interesting information. And the first thing that it does is to give you a look back at what they would have recommended in 2011 when they were last in Barbados. And I'm just going to speak a little bit about the historical and I think the present context of Barbados. And I'm going to focus specifically on the monetary and the fiscal policy that is emanating out of the report. And then I'm going to make a few conclusions. Now, disclaimer. I want everybody to understand very clearly the IMF is not out to get Barbados. And you have to understand what this means because there's a lot of rhetoric regarding what the IMF is and isn't. Okay, so I just want us to be clear in our minds that the IMF in the context of Barbados right now is like a doctor. Okay? Barbados is a member of the IMF. Every year, there's supposed to be a consultation, so everyone in this room, I assume, goes to the doctor periodically. The doctor gives you an assessment. Okay? The IMF is like a doctor for all the countries in the world. The doctor will make some recommendations. You take on board what you want or not. Okay? So I just want you to be clear that the IMF is not out to get Barbados. Now, obviously, if you ignore the advice of your doctor, okay, you don't take your medicine that has been prescribed, there are consequences. Now, it does not mean that the doctor is mean or he doesn't care about you, but the point is, when you let things slide long enough, it reaches a point where you have to have some significant intervention. It's no longer normal medicine will work, okay? And I think we have to be mindful that that is the role that the IMF is playing right now, and we have to be mindful that in the current circumstance that we have found ourselves in, it is going to take a significant amount of heavy lifting going forward, whoever is going to be in charge of the affairs of the country. Some significant heavy lifting is required, okay? Now, the first thing that they did, no, I did mention that the IMF usually would visit every country of which that is a member every year to do the assessment. The last one was 2011, and they gave some recommendations then, and they have cited the very first page of the report, okay? You can see here that the main recommendation specifically would have been to reduce the deficit, specifically by lowering the wage bill and cutting transfers to public enterprises. But I want to bring your attention specifically to points 2 and 3, which I think are very critical in terms of the context of Barbados right now, which is monetary policy that's credible and reduce the reliance on the NIS. I think those are the two main recommendations, other than just number 1, that I think are absolutely critical. Now, it says here many of the recommendations were not addressed. Now, in the report, I believe the IMF was very kind to Barbados in the language that it chose to use to describe the current situation. The truth is that the government has not credibly done anything significant to addressing the problem that would have been highlighted in 2011, 2010, 2009, 2008. Okay? So we have to be mindful that every year that you put off the adjustments, it means every year you're adding to the problem. The problem is getting larger. Okay? Now, I apologize if this slide is a bit wordy. I just lifted this text specifically because these are the immediate policy priorities that they would have highlighted in the report. All 82 pages, they've cut them down into about 6 points, which are absolutely important. And remember, these are the staff's view. So it's like your doctor giving you an assessment. They look at your current condition and they assess you. Okay? So, and the most important thing you will find throughout the text, there are constant references to the PEG, which is the exchange rate, to the 1, which we all know. There's constant references to that. Now, generally speaking, in most reports before, there would have been 1 or 2 references, but never to the extent, I think, as we have seen this time. And I think that is the message that we absolutely have to be clear, that if we want to maintain the PEG, then the heavy lifting that we are talking about has to be done. Okay, you have to be clear in your mind what that means, and I think you will have some articulation of that, of course, I think, going forward. Okay, but specifically, number one says to implement some significant spending cuts, and the government has started belatedly to address that very recently. However, I am not convinced it is enough, but that's a subject for debate. But number two, which I think is absolutely critical, and you'll see in the presentation later, see central bank financing of the fiscal deficit. Now, you would have heard a number of my colleagues speaking on this issue, and it is something that it is particularly distressing, because it's a situation where the central bank now has become a willing participant by facilitating the excess spending of government. And I'm going to show you a bit later why that is, but that should not be so. Okay? Raise the interest rates. This one is also interesting because 2 and 3 actually relates to the same thing, because now you see here a reference to the exchange rate, which is the same thing as the peg in black above. So there are constant references throughout the document to the peg, and everything leads to the peg, because our anchor, as far as the economy is concerned, is maintaining the peg first, everything else after. Okay? Now, number 4, which relates to capital outflows. Now, clearly, if you are concerned about the integrity of the exchange rate and you are an investor, then any uncertainty, you want to get your money out. That's normal, because you want to protect your investment, and so therefore any excess cash you remove from the system, because obviously that will lose value. So again, within, and they would have listed, as I said, 6 immediate priorities, of which 3 here you can see the specific reference to the peg, which is fundamentally important. Never before would we have seen such explicit references to the peg and the integrity of it. And the last 2 really are important, but in the context of where we are right now in terms of time and space, there's not a lot that can be done on, well, except for number 6, but specifically there's not a lot that can be done as far as the unions are concerned. That's a subject for an entire discussion right now. Now, let me just give you some historical context so that we understand where we are. I think if you were to ask Barbadians what were some of the defining characteristics of Barbados, of course we will all come up with different things, but I fundamentally believe that amongst some of the things that we would list, you will find some of these things that I have listed here somewhere on each of our lists here. So, an education system which is free at the point of delivery. I think that everybody would agree that has been one of the hallmarks in terms of our development in Barbados. 2, healthcare. Again, free at the point of delivery for most services. I think we will all agree that education and health would be pretty much top on the agenda. Again, the fixed exchange rate, because in the context of the Caribbean, the stability of the peg, along with the education and health and health investments that we've made, would have led us to this point. And then I think I had the good fortune of doing a bit of traveling quite recently, up and down the OECS, and each time I caught a taxi, this is early last year, every time I caught a taxi, the taxi guy would want to know what's going on in Barbados. It's a very serious thing, because one guy actually said to me on one of the trips that as a taxi guy, obviously you're at the airport and you see people coming in and out. So when you see, whether it's the IMF, the CDB, or whoever coming into the country, these guys know who's coming in and out. So he asked me, this is another Caribbean country. So he says to me, well, why are you making all these trips here all the time? Because obviously if you're making these trips all the time, something must be happening. So in the course of that conversation, the guy said to me, Barbados has always had, as opposed to the other Eastern Caribbean countries, fiscal discipline. Okay? Fiscal discipline. I think that's something that we should be proud of, and something that we must fight to ensure is maintained. So I just wanted to have that context. I'm going to take you through now just a series of slides which will demonstrate that discipline and bring you now to the current position as far as the report and where the public finances are. So, fiscal discipline in the context of Barbados, I want us to be absolutely clear what that means, okay? And small island economies. The black bar is your current revenue. The orange bar is your current expenditure, which means like your normal, if you think of it, your household, you have your income and your expenditure, your normal shopping and stuff that you do on a monthly basis, okay? So, Barbados from 1955 to this will cover the Grantley Adams administration. You will see that the black bar is always above the orange bar. Simple. You need to produce a surplus on your current account, this is what it means, okay? So that you can use that to do other things. Now, I just wanted to be clear. We have always run a fiscal deficit. Now, the fiscal deficit in the past would have derived from the green bar, the capital expenditure. These are the investments in the same education, in the same health, in the road infrastructure, even the tourism plant, so to speak. The government has assisted in building that out. And so therefore, I want us to appreciate that a lot of the debt that exists in Barbados up until now would have been driven by continued investment, what is known as capital formation in the country. We are in a school. I don't know when this school was built, but certainly this would be one of those capital investments that would be in one of these green bars here along the way. So every government has had capital investment. Every government has added to the debt through capital investment. Okay? Now, not every government would have added to the debt in terms of the current account, which is, as I just said, where the black bar must exceed the orange bar. So I want you to bear that in mind as I go through the next series of slides and as it relates to fiscal discipline. Okay? Now, you move to the next phase, 1962 to 63 to 76, 77. Now, you would have had two periods here where the orange bar would have been above. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong specifically there, because from time to time, as you know, in your household, you may have, from one month to the next, you may have a little cash flow problem, so therefore you need to borrow to cover your current, your normal bills. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, because obviously over the course of the year, you may be able to recover. But fundamentally, you will see here that of the number of years here, you would have had two very small deficits. In total, it's 12.8 million over that, 15-year span, approximately there. So, again, discipline. Capital investment goes on as well all through that period. You move to the next phase. Again, the black bars are consistently above the orange bar. Consistently. Fiscal discipline. Here, now, even during the Sandiford administration, again, fiscal discipline. Even though we would have we had a balance of payments problem, but the fiscal situation was completely different to what it is now. And again, the 2 years that there would have been a deficit on the current account, it would have been $29 million in total. Now, what that means is that when you're not covering your current expenditure from your current revenue, you have to borrow from somewhere to cover the difference. So the numbers in yellow really are what would have been adding to the debt. Now, remember, as I said, every government would have run a fiscal deficit driven by the capital account, the green bar. So in terms of the amalgam of debt over the years, every government would have contributed that, but not every government would have contributed to the debt from running a current account deficit. It's absolutely important that we understand what that means. Okay? So you had the after administration, and you will see that the black bar is significantly above the green, the orange bar all throughout that period. Okay? Now, this is where things get interesting. Okay? Now, remember, context. Okay? This is 2008-9. You see a reversal, right? The difference now is 189 million difference between the current expenditure and the current revenue. So what that means is you would have borrowed, in addition to the capital expenditure, you would have borrowed $189 million, which means you're adding that to the debt. Okay? 2009-10. Okay? Now, now, this is what I refer to now as the indiscipline in terms of the public finances. Because you can see here that there's been relatively small investments by way of capital expenditure. But the debt would have accumulated by some $2.64 billion just by running the current account deficits. Now, I hope we appreciate the magnitude of these numbers, because never before had we even run a fiscal deficit even close to the size of these current account deficits. And all the numbers that you would have seen before, they probably added to about $43 million in total in terms of current account, or the debt that would have been driven from any current account deficit. So this is where we are today. And this the last chart that I brought up would have been data up to December 2013. Now you can clearly see that that is only 9 months of the fiscal year. And the 505 current account deficit is almost what the entire thing was at the end of 2012-13. So even though we're in a period where we're supposed to be adjusting, we're still spending more. Okay? Now, interestingly though, we did borrow some money from the NAS to give the Transport Board UE and stuff. So if you really think about it, even though you borrowed from somebody else, you still consumed the electricity. You still had goods and services to pay for. So I haven't included these numbers here because these are approximations and I don't have any hard data on it. But those monies would have come from there as well. Okay? Now, so this is where we are now. Now, remember before, I don't think anybody would, in your list of what would characterize Barbados, maintaining jobs in the public sector, I think would be very low on your agenda, because there are consequences for such a policy when you refuse to address the problem. As I showed you in the previous chart, you would have seen the size of those deficits manifesting themselves year after year and you do nothing about it. Okay? Now, it does not mean that you just cut willy-nilly, but fundamentally, what you have to bear in mind is that when you are sacrificing other things, and this is where things get interesting, because if you're going to be paying for education, you're going to be paying for health, the exchange rate is actually under threat. There's even the possibility of default, because the size of those deficits that you're running, I'm going to show you in a slide or two later, that it is a real possibility that the government could default on any of its obligations. And so when you think of that, maintaining jobs in the public sector can't be high on your agenda, because I don't think it doesn't make sense spending money to maintain jobs and you can't deliver the services that you're intended to deliver. And it's something that we have to be mindful of when we mean by service delivery from the public sector and hiring the specific resources to deliver those services. It's something that I think as Barbadians we have to be clear what that means, and what that means for the country, what that means for the exchange rate, what that means for education, what that means for health. Because you're spending money and not getting the specific return that you would want to get going forward. Now, back to the report, because the context is important in terms of what is in the report. Because the report will highlight what hasn't been done, and I've shown you the magnitude of those deficits. But I think this is probably excuse me. No. The monetary policy should be consistent with the exchange rate. And I worked at the central bank in the past, and I don't recall any specific reference using this kind of language before. Monetary policy should be consistent with the exchange rate regime. Now, this is something that is, if you are trained in the central bank, this is like number one. The monetary policy must be consistent with the peg. Okay? Now, specifically paragraph 32. Right? Now, by monetary policy, what this means is the central bank. when it refers to monetary policy, you're talking about the Central Bank of Barbados. The policy of the Central Bank of Barbados should be consistent with maintaining the 2-to-1. That is what we all want. And as far as I'm aware, I don't think anybody necessarily disagrees with that. But that hasn't changed. So when the IMF is saying to not just Barbados, but to the world, that the central bank is not pursuing policies that is consistent with the exchange rate, you have issues. You have serious issues. There are issues with confidence, there's issues with credibility, there's issues with attracting investment. Fundamental. Now, irrespective of the government's position, only slightly, the central bank has to be the anchor. Has to be the anchor. If all else fails, we must be able to rely on the central bank to do its job, essentially. And the IMF is saying all through the report that the central bank has not done its job. Okay? Now, specifically, the Central Bank of Barbados should clarify the monetary framework by reiterating that the primary objective of monetary policy is to safeguard the exchange rate anchor and making international reserves the operational target. This is the actual text in the report. This is the text in the report. This is what everybody will read in the report. Everybody. Not just Barbadians, not just local business people. Everybody. This is the text in the report. Never before has there ever been any specific reference to the central bank in an IMF report. It's always focused on the government because essentially you're looking at the operational aspects of government. You're looking at the rest of the economy, trying to see obviously how you can get both in sync, but never before has there been any specific reference to the central bank in this manner. And I'm deliberately going to read this so that everybody hears. The policy stance should be reoriented to better support the peg by allowing short-term rates to more closely reflect market conditions that embody a credible foreign risk premium. Now, what this means is, now I'm not sure if you're aware, but just about a year ago, the government would have raised the treasury bill limit by $1 billion. Do you remember that? Right. What that means is that essentially the government increased its own credit card limit. We all could, if we had that power, yeah, may or may not be a good thing. But the government raised its own credit card limit, so to speak. Now, in the meantime, what the central bank has done is it has intervened in the treasury bill market, and it actually said so later in the document. But essentially, what the central bank has essentially done is to try to keep treasury bill rates low so that it keeps the cost of borrowing for government down. Okay? So in effect, what the IMF is saying is that the central bank is deliberately trying to determine what Barbados' foreign risk premium is. Now, essentially what that means is that we have to, as a fixed exchange rate, we have to maintain a certain difference between our interest rates and interest rates internationally, particularly in the United States. Okay? And that is usually determined by the fundamentals of the economy, not by a specific institution. So investors will determine what Barbados would essentially pay in terms of if you want to borrow from overseas, specifically what Barbados would pay as that extra. Okay. Now, in the past, we would have done we would have not directly intervened in the foreign exchange, in the treasury bill market, but specifically we would ensure that interest rates were sufficiently higher than those interest rates in the United States to attract investment. Okay? What this is saying is that the central bank is essentially keeping the interest rates low than what the ordinary should be to attract that investment in order to keep the cost of financing for government down. I hope everybody is absolutely clear on that. Okay? So, this is just the rest of that specific text, but I wanted to bring those 2 points to you there again because the monetary and fiscal policy is absolutely fundamental for confidence in the economy, and it's something that the IMF is now saying, not that we didn't know that already, but it is there for the world to see, that the monetary policy specifically is not consistent with the exchange rate regime. Paragraph 33. Now, it says explicitly, no, that the central bank should end direct financing of the government. So, you see the slide with the current account deficit that I showed you before, a lot of that is coming, a lot of the money to make up those deficits coming from the central bank, along with the NAS, but from the central bank. Now, let me just state, just as a quick aside, the national insurance investing in the government is not government securities, that is. Government securities is not necessarily an issue, simply because they have to match their long-term liabilities with long-term securities in order to be able to provide pensions in the future. So there's nothing wrong with that. What I think is wrong is taking money specifically to finance the current operations of government, like what it would have done with those, because there's no return there, okay? And the truth is, given that the national insurance at the moment, from what has been said, they don't have an issue with paying benefits right now, then they really shouldn't be buying treasury bills. But that's a separate thing. Separate thing. But I wanted you to focus on what is the third bullet here. And specifically when it says, since the authorities' adjustment policies will take time to restore external stability and rebuild buffers, and this is related to central bank now, they may need to tighten implementation of existing capital controls in the event of significant market disturbance and outflows. Now, sometime last year, the central bank governor would have said that the government would have needed to cut its expenditure by $400 million by March of this year, March 2014. Okay? Now, when this report would have been, when the IMF was here in December, this is the base, this is when they would have done the assessment. And it's important to understand why they're saying that the monetary policy should be consistent with the exchange rate anchor. In June, the governor said he needed to cut by $400 million by the end of March. However, between June and December, the central bank would have lent the government directly $228 million. So, if you tell people you got to cut the expenditure, you can't give them money to spend. Okay? Now, if you think of the economy as a football team, so imagine that this is the case. The central bank is in the goal bar. Yeah? The central bank is the goalie. Remember, the objective is to maintain the peg. So, government and NAS, agriculture and construction somewhat makes up the defense of the country, because you've got to be able to feed yourself. Yeah? Construction is the capital formation in the economy, through which investment flows. Government and NAS, obviously, Social Security, and the government needs to provide legislation and such things. Okay? Education and health, the banks, financial institutions, is your midfield. Because in order for you to execute anything, you need those two things working in tandem. Yeah? So, you have the wholesale and retail, like your rest of the midfield, your manufacturing, working in there. Now, what I propose here is that in the current context, tourism and international business are your strikers. They're the ones who are going to do the good, who are really going to, after everybody else has taken care of what they need to do, these are the guys that are basically going to score the goals for you. Yeah? So the essence of this team is that everybody has their part to play. And this is what I want you to bear in mind here. Okay? Everybody has their part to play. And you know full well that in order for everybody to do their part, it is important to have guidance. Now, the goalkeeper ain't just there to stop the shots that coming in. The goalkeeper is there also to tell you, as government, as education, as tourism, whatever, you're looking down the field, you're out of position. You need to come back. You need to come back. You need to cover. because you need to ensure that everybody is working together to achieve the specific objective, because you don't want to get scored on. You don't want to get scored on. Okay? So bear that in mind. So I go back to the report again. Monitor, and mind you, this is the consistency in the report, the references. All right? Now, this is the central bank's response in terms of what they would have said to the IMF during that time. And I think it's something that we have to be clear. Okay? So they said that they recognize the need to end this is in December, only then, apparently. Okay? Excuse me. Right. So as I mentioned earlier, the central bank, now, and the reason I have it highlighted in red is because the blue at the top is that is their job. Yeah? That is their job. So when the IMF comes and says, look, guys, this is the situation, because as I said, normally they will make recommendations to government about what they need to do. And remember, you're the patient. The government is like the patient, yeah? This is what you need to do. Now, you know, sometimes we may be so ill that someone needs to accompany us to the doctor, right? So instead of the doctor speaking to you, they're speaking to the person that is accompanying you. Something is wrong. Something is wrong. Now, I just wanted to be clear. There are specific references for the government, and I think we all appreciate what needs to be done as far as the government is concerned. But remember, the monetary policy should be consistent with the exchange rate regime. And the central bank is saying it is concerned with higher interest rates, which could raise the financing costs of government. This is stated in the report. Two completely different things. Two completely different things. So imagine I take you to the doctor tell you, well, you know, you need to stop drinking, for example. And then as soon as you leave the doctor, I carry you by the nearest rum shop. Yeah? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. So I just want us to be clear what the difference between quantitative easing and printing money in the context of this report, so that we're all absolutely clear. Now, in the United States, and as happened in Europe as well, I'm just using the United States as an example. So at the top here, you have the Federal Reserve, right? These are banks. This is Congress, firms, and households, right, in the economy. Now, in response to the crisis, the Congress, under Obama, reduced taxation as well as expenditure. The banks continue to purchase their securities at all levels, all levels. However, the banks did have a problem in terms of liquidity at some point. Okay, they weren't lending to one another, so therefore the operations of banks kind of would have came to a halt temporarily. So, what the Federal Reserve did was to purchase from the banks government securities as well as some other high-value corporate securities. Okay? Gave them money in return, the banks, which they then used to increase lending to businesses and to households. Everybody with me? Right. Now, what that would have done is it reduced some of the employment, because obviously businesses started, once money is circulating in the economy, there's demand, businesses start to grow, reduce unemployment, you get growth, and therefore the government now gets increased revenue. So it starts to close its deficit. That is what took place in the United States. It has taken place in Europe. To some degree, there's still parts of Europe that are still working its way through that, but it's working its way through that. Okay? This is Barbados. Okay? The government increased taxes and expenditure. Yeah? The commercial banks now decided, well, this is not really sustainable, so we're going to limit our exposure to them. So therefore, we're only going to buy treasury bills. 90 days, 180 days, nothing more, because we can't trust the government essentially to pay back beyond that. Yeah? Now, with the increased taxation, obviously there's less disposable income in the economy, less demand for firms, and therefore decreased confidence. Now, in response to that, clearly if there's more unemployment, the risk of default, banks will not lend as much as they would normally. Therefore, the economy contracts. Less revenue for government. Okay? So, what the central bank does is to buy newly issued treasury bills, which increases the debt of government because you're facilitating spending, current account spending at that. Whereas, in the case of the quantitative easing, what the Federal Reserve would have bought was existing debt. Okay? So I want us to be clear what we mean by the printing of money. Now, when you do that, it means then there's money in the economy that's not earned. Money in the economy that's not earned, all that serves to do is to increase what would be the demand for foreign exchange. Okay? So then you get foreign reserve losses, which we all are aware of took place during 2013. Now, the chart I showed you before, during the time of 2008 until now, you would have had some foreign inflows helping to maintain the level of reserves. During 2013, clearly there was again, the monetary policy was important in terms of the confidence for attracting the usual inflows that you would get. And it's something that we have to be mindful of, and it's the one thing that I will say to you this evening. Yes, the government has a fiscal problem, and there's a lot of heavy lifting to be done. But the central bank has to do its part. Now, so this is the position. The government is spending out of position. It's drawn the NAS into it, and the central bank has followed. The goal is unattended. This is a very serious thing, because the central bank, if the goalkeeper is out of position, he can't tell anybody, yeah? There's no confidence. As you can see here in my little diagram, the banks are as far away as possible as they could be, while still in position, because they're in the midfield. Yeah? Tourism and international business pretty much off the field. They're still there or thereabouts, but pretty much off. So we have a problem from defense, starting with the goalkeeper, all the way through. Now, everybody else pretty much still in position for the most part, but you need guidance. You need to be confident that the goalkeeper is going to have your back. Yeah? Now, my conclusion. The report says that there is scope for easing the issues over a 5-year horizon. Now, when you estimate that we borrowed $300 million at the end of December, and we've already lost $100 million or so for the first 5 weeks, then of that $300 million, at a time when, under normal circumstances, the worst you would expect to do is to maintain the level of reserves in January. Just maintaining the amount of reserves you had in December in January is the worst position that you would expect, given that that is the height of the tourist season. Okay? We've lost $100 million. So I don't anticipate we have 5 years to resolve the fiscal problem. So my conclusion is that we have to eliminate the current account on the public finances as quickly as we can get it done. It will cause some discomfort, but if we want to maintain the integrity of the peg, it is what we have to do. We have to do it. Because the discipline that has accompanied the public finances up until now must be regained. Now, this is not discipline. Okay? Everybody is out of position. Now, so the central bank simply must return to the penalty box. When you're in the penalty box, the goalie can do pretty much anything. That's his space. Yeah? But you must be in the box. You could be at the edge, but you must be in the box. You must be in the box. Okay? Now, restructuring of that debt. Remember I showed you that chart with the current account deficits, $2.6 billion in debt that would have emanated from those current account deficits. We absolutely must be able to restructure that debt in the meantime. Because even when you eliminate the deficit, the current account deficit, you still have interest payments that you have to service out of your revenue. And so therefore you must be able to ease, to create some fiscal space is what is the term that you would use. We must do that. We must do that. And the report will cite that, but specifically they will done so in the context of what I would have showed you in the last slide, that both the government and the central bank is out of position, so to speak, out of sync. The fiscal policy and the monetary policy is not working. Okay? I think you would have heard some reference to that very recently. Now, what that would mean, though, what that will mean is, as it relates to education and health, we have to completely rethink how we do education and health. We can't think of them merely as social services anymore. We must think of them in terms of what economic value we can actually get from the investment that we've already made. So we've got to almost flip the switch and think of it, yes, there is still some social good to be done, but we now have to focus on how we are going to actually effectively determine how we spend that money and what we get back for that money. I think that's something that we have to be clear in our minds going forward, because if you want to maintain the integrity of the peg and maintain education and health at the way in its current form, it is going to be a very difficult thing to do. We have to rethink everything as it relates to education and health, which means you have to do some means testing. You're going to have to do some insurance. You're going to have to think about, I have a son that is 5 years old, and I see some children here. Their parents have to think about putting aside money possibly for their education at the tertiary level in 10 to 15 years. You have to think about these things. Because if we want to maintain a peg, as I said, there's a lot of heavy lifting that is going to be, that it is required, and we can't shy away from it. We simply can't. Now, I can't say any clearer. Growth is very important going forward. There will not be growth once the fiscal deficit is the size that it is, driven by the current account. There will be no growth because they will constantly be dragging money out of the system that should be spent on actually driving growth going forward. So the government is essentially sucking all the air out of the economy and they expect you to breathe. Yeah? So you must eliminate that deficit so that monies that are going there will go elsewhere. Okay? Now, and it also goes to, again, the central bank. I think the central bank has to be the anchor to bring back some measure of discipline to the public finances. As I said, never in a Article 4 consultation has there been explicit references to the central bank not playing its part. It is not playing its part. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for your attention.